Looking for an interesting and good book describing the history of the German Democratic Republic from the beginning till the end? Then watch this video. And if you don't like reading, some interesting facts about East Germany are discussed as well in this video. So in any case, stay tuned. Hi and welcome to another East Germany Investigators video. With today an interview with Katja Hoyer. Katja studied history at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in former East Germany, and she's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She writes for several newspapers like the Washington Post and Die Welt on German and European politics. And Katja is also the author of 2 books available in several languages. The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871-1918, that came out 2 years ago, and Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949-1990, that came out this year. And that's the book we're going to talk about today a little bit with Katja. Katja, I'm really proud to have you here on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
People sometimes ask me what is a good book to read on East Germany, and I think your book is an excellent choice because it covers the full history of the country. What was your motivation to write the book?
Well, there were 2 reasons really. One is a very personal one. I am a historian, but I'm also somebody who is actually from East Germany. So I was born in the GDR in 1985, but obviously that makes me a very young inhabitant of that state. So I wasn't sort of politically experiencing it in the way that, adults would have been. And so for me, there was always a degree of curiosity. What was the state like? What would my life have looked like if it had continued longer, or if I'd been born a little bit earlier? And so in that respect, this is kind of also me going back a little bit to try and investigate this sort of strange state that I was born into, but that doesn't exist anymore today. And my second reason was from the perspective of the sort of adult historian that I am now. Giving East Germany a bit more of a place in German history. I always feel, West Germany is kind of treated as the continuation story. It's the state that deliberately said it was kind of the legal, if you will, successor of the states that came before. It still exists today in its status. So East Germany kind of became the side story to that, or the footnote almost. And I think that's odd, given that we're talking 41 years of history here, that one part of the country has experienced, the other one hasn't. So there's also a part of me that wants to make a kind of room for East Germany in the German story. So those were my 2 motivations really for writing the book.
So it's a personal one and a more general one, so to say. So the book came out, and I first didn't realize, because I first saw it in a German bookstore. It came out in English at first. And then the second step was German, or what was exactly the thought behind the multiple language steps there?
Well, actually the first foreign language version that was out was actually the Dutch one. They were super quick in publishing it in Holland as well, and I only in the Netherlands as well, and I only then realized how many connections there actually were, for instance, between Dutch people in the GDR. Some of them had been on holiday there, some of them had family connections, so there also seems to be a kind of big personal interest there for many people. So the idea was really to write this book for a Western audience, and I live and work in the UK, so for me it was kind of natural to write this book in English first, to open it up to as many people as possible. And also there isn't as much literature in English on the GDR already as there is in German. So to me, this kind of opened the whole story of the GDR up to a wider audience, and it also links into the idea of giving it a place in kind of German and European history, in that external people in an international context can find out about the GDR and how it actually fits into the German story, which was more difficult beforehand, just because there wasn't much sort of accessible non-fiction on the GDR out there. And then the Germans quickly became interested in it as well, and asked for the translation rights for a German version, but I didn't know that was going to happen before I started writing. So the book is really not conceived as such for a German audience in the first place.
So would you have written it differently if it would be for a German audience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the I haven't translated it myself either, despite the fact that German is, of course, my first language. So in theory, I could have sort of written my own German version, but it would indeed be a different book. I mean, for one thing, I would have had to place it within the context of the books that are already there in Germany, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to kind of start again from scratch and look at the whole picture to start with, rather than assuming that everybody had already read all the other books out there, because I was addressing, I think, a much wider audience than the previous books had. And I think, secondly, there's of course a different cultural context there. So there's a political debate very much going on in Germany around, how far has kind of reunification worked. There are very, very strong feelings, both East and West, about, how people feel about this process, and it's these kind of things that you need to take into account. And thirdly, there's a certain language that's been used in Germany to talk about the GDR already over the last 30 years. And if I'd used the same, so if I'd written in German, basically, I would have had to decide to either use the same words and phrases as have been used before,
Mm.
or deliberately not use them. But one way or another, I would have had to make a decision where I position myself in the existing inter-German kind of dialogue, which is not what I was trying to do. I was trying to sort of give the world a book that it could access the GDR from, rather than kind of join the fray and, and discuss the GDR within the German context. So this is more of a side product, really, of what I was trying to do than the main intention.
So, as your first intention was to focus on the readers outside of Germany, I would be curious if you can also recognize this in the sales figures of the German version of the book compared to the English version.
Well, I was very pleased to see that it was a bestseller in both the UK and in Germany. So in that respect, it's done incredibly well in both settings. It was received very differently, but there was huge interest in both countries, and in lots of other countries as well. It's now been translated in, I think, 12 languages in total, and we're still, looking at different translations that are still coming out. As far flung as sort of South Korea and the US and Greece, and all sorts of countries where you think there isn't necessarily an obvious link there, but there is lots of interest in different countries as well. So it's done very well in different contexts, but I think for different reasons.
Okay. So what I saw on the internet, there's you've been on tour a lot. I think you're still traveling a lot also to promote the book. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been a bit crazy. So the last sort of 3 weeks in particular, I mean, there was a point where within 10 days I'd sort of gone from Hamburg back to London to Berlin to a small village in Brandenburg, then off to Washington via Munich, and then back to Berlin via Zurich. So it was insane, talking about East Germany and all of these settings, but all in different ways, because the interest in what people are actually looking for from that story are so different wherever you go. So I've spoken in lots of different countries about it and found it very interesting how different people draw different aspects out of that story. So to give you one example, for instance, when I was talking about it in Dublin in Ireland, people were very, very interested in the idea of a divided nation and how do you bring that back together, because of course the conflict with Northern Ireland is still very much alive, and that was kind of the story that people were interested in. Is it possible to bring a nation back together after a long time of division? And if so, how does that work? What are the problems? Or you talk to people in Finland about it, and they are very interested in aspects like the Stasi and collaboration, because that's what they're currently debating. Finland's kind of odd position during the Cold War between the two blocs meant that it had a very close relationship with East Germany. And as a result of that, many Finns ended up collaborating with the Stasi, and they're currently debating around, should they disclose those files? Should they find out which Finns were working with the Stasi now that they've joined NATO, to make sure that the same people don't get access to kind of very sensitive information now. So it falls into very different cultural contexts wherever you go. People are interested in different things.
Yeah, and then you have Germany. So there is you have the East and the West, but even what I understood, it's not even that easy, because even the response you get from East Germany can also be very different.
Yeah, if anything, I felt that was more pronounced actually than the East-West divide, because in East Germany there's been a tendency since 1990 for very specific groups of people to talk about their past in the GDR. So those people that received funding and scholarships and sort of positions at universities and think basically the permission to speak about the GDR and the funding to speak about the GDR were people who were previously involved in opposition or had a very critical view of the GDR for one reason and another. Often people who'd kind of seen the sharp end of Stasi repression in their own lives were now talking about the GDR, and obviously they do that through a very specific lens. They look at the GDR through its kind of most repressive aspects. And that's, of course, a really important part of the story. But it did mean that lots of people who didn't have that experience as their main experience of the GDR, who sort of led lives that were either compliant with the regime or, as in most cases, found some sort of compromise solution where people sort of lived their lives knowing that they lived in a dictatorship and knowing that there was repression, but finding ways around that and kind of underneath that to live their lives. Those people's stories hadn't been heard as much, and that's kind of what I'm focusing on, because I do think that that is the majority experience, that people kind of live between the extremes of kind of complete compliance with the regime, and on the other hand sort of complete opposition. Most people, I think, found themselves somewhere in between, and it's those people who I focus on, and so as a result of that, it leads quite far away from the way that the GDR has been talked about so far, and that's making a lot of people very angry or nervous about the idea that it could kind of further nostalgic feelings, or it's gone too far the other way. And as a result of that, it's led to a very lively, to put it mildly, lively debate within or amongst East Germans themselves as well. So it's very interesting where I do talks and debates in Germany. So if it's in Berlin, for example, it always ends up being very controversial and very heated, the debate, quite often panel debates as well. Whilst if you go kind of deeper into East Germany, if you will, so I've done talks in, for instance, Magdeburg, and I'm in Guben, which was my own birthplace, and I've never really returned to it since then. But I'm going back there to do a talk. It's a very different atmosphere. You basically get people coming along saying that this book has kind of made them talk and think about aspects of their lives that they hadn't really addressed in a long time. I'm being sent emails by East Germans, who kind of say, right, I've read your book, and on page 74 you really speak about something that meant something to me, or people sent me their entire life stories as a document that they've never shown somebody else. So there's a real desire to talk, but also a kind of struggle over who is allowed to talk about the GDR in what way. So that is still very much going on amongst East Germans as well. It's a healthy debate to have, I think.
Do you think that the timing of the book, now being 33 years after the German unification, plays a role in how the book is received by the audience compared to, for example, if you would have published it 10 years ago?
I think it does. The timing is important. I mean, in my thinking, when I sort of thought about whether to write this book now or leave it for a while, my thinking behind it was that it is a generation now. It's people like me who were either young children or even people who were born sort of 5 years after me and haven't had any experience of the GDR at all, who are, I think, able to talk about it in a more detached manner. So this isn't our story. This isn't something that we experienced ourselves, and therefore I think it's possible to talk about it as a part of history rather than a part of sort of living memory, if you will. So for me, this is almost as far away as, say, Imperial Germany, which I wrote my first book about, which is 150 years ago. But to me, both of these kind of parts of German history have got relevance for today, but they're not my own story, and therefore I can write about it without anger or nostalgia, I think, and that makes it easier, I think, to distance myself from it, because I don't sit there and think, right, what was my experience and how can I make sure that when I write about the GDR, it's sort of reflecting my own experience. It's me as a historian looking at this, and that does help. I was also hoping that that generational gap between now and then would allow for a calmer and more rational sort of debate about it, which I think I'd underestimated how many people do still feel very, very strongly and emotionally about the stuff that they've experienced, because of course one generation means that there's still sort of 2 generations at least who have actually experienced it, and they're still part of the debate, and rightly part of the debate as well. And so from that angle, there's still that sort of hotness there that might have also, or would have definitely also been there in the 90s and in the early 2000s. I think it's also helped that some of the reunification measures have been successful. So the fact that, yes, you do still have differences in wealth and infrastructure and all sorts of other things, but they are getting smaller. So there's a sense now that, for instance, unemployment, which was a huge issue in the late 90s and early 2000s, when at times sort of a quarter, sometimes up to a quarter of East Germans were unemployed. Once these figures kind of were less severe, there's also an easier way almost into this topic. But I certainly think it would have been very difficult to address the things in the way that I have, say 10, 15 years ago. And the other thing is, it tends to also come up, this topic again after certain periods of time. And I think now is a time when, independent of my book, there was already a debate going on about the East in particular, which other books have furthered as well. But also, in politics, it's very obvious when you look at voting patterns and things like that, that the sort of shape of the GDR on a map doesn't disappear. It comes up, whenever you do a survey of any kind of description. So one way or another is still relevant, but maybe a bit further away, and therefore one can talk about it a bit more freely.
Let us take a look at the contents of the book a bit. So, talking about the positions of the Soviets, how did they regard East Germany? So, compared to the other Eastern Bloc countries, it was a kind of special situation because you had the Iron Curtain running through Germany. Did they need more attention from the Soviets because of this position, or were there some other reasons why East Germany maybe would have had a special role for the Soviets, like economic ones?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are historians who will disagree with me, but I do think that East Germany wasn't really meant to be part of the Soviet Empire in the way that the Eastern European states are. I mean, you see very, very quickly after the Second World War was concluded in Europe that Stalin immediately makes a grab for the Eastern European countries, in that elections get rigged, and very quickly it becomes obvious. Stalin explicitly makes that point at some of the conferences as well, where he basically says that he considers this influence over Eastern Europe, war booty. He needs kind of safety, but also he needs to show something to his people what the sacrifice was for. Whilst Germany wasn't supposed to be divided to start with, there was a very clear notion that it should be only temporarily administered by the 4 occupying powers, and it was kind of divided up into 4 zones of occupation rather than separate countries to start with. And you see at every step where that divide between East and West kind of solidifies, that Stalin is incredibly reluctant about this whole thing. He constantly summons the German communists, who he could kind of tasked with setting up structures in his zone of occupation, back to Moscow, to tell them off basically for trying to pursue a course where they get their own socialist state in Germany. He doesn't want that to start with, and that becomes very obvious from the sort of meeting protocols and things like that. I think that there's 2 reasons for that. On the one hand side, I think what Stalin needed most was reparations out of Germany, and Germany is different from the other Eastern European countries in that it lost the war. It was the enemy. That can't be said for countries like Poland, for example, Czechoslovakia, who were all kind of victims of Nazism as well. They also weren't treated nice by Stalin, that's not what I'm saying, but they weren't kind of the loser here who needs to pay reparations like Germany did. And the problem is that Stalin received the northeast of Germany, which is very agrarian and very sort of underdeveloped compared to the Western zones that the Western Allies got, with the Ruhr region in it, for example. So the moment Germany splits into 2 and the reparations can't be drawn upon from other parts of the country that Stalin has no control over, Stalin loses access to a lot of reparations, particularly industrial material and steel and coal and all of these things that don't really exist in the East, or at least not in the quantities. And so that is one reason I think why he was reluctant to give up on the idea of a kind of neutral, unified Germany. And I think the second one is there is some bizarre admiration that Stalin still has even after everything for Germany. He does still talk about Beethoven and culture and German poets, and there's kind of a sense that Germany isn't a country to be kind of ruled over by Moscow, by Russia, but rather it's kind of a on the other side of the cultural divide. It's an enemy, but somebody to take seriously, somebody that you look in the eye, that doesn't become kind of your part of your empire in the way that the fellow Slavic nations do, in Stalin's opinion. I think you can still see that kind of attitude today with Putin kind of making very similar arguments. For a long time he looked to Germany as a partner, somebody that you dealt with over the heads of all the Eastern European nations who are seen as kind of lesser states in the eyes of Moscow politicians. So I think all of that works together to put East Germany in a very strange position, in that the Soviets are never all that keen to have it in the first place. I mean, I quote Soviet politicians in the book as well, where they say, what is this German Democratic Republic? It'd be nothing without us. This kind of idea that they decide whether East Germany exists or not. It could be traded in at any point as well. So there are lots of reasons why I think East Germany is kind of the unwanted child, really, of the Soviet Empire, and needs special attention because it needs building up rather than the reparations that they want out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and also later in the 60s, when the economic situation in the GDR gets better, Ulbricht even becomes a bit arrogant towards the Soviets, stating that the economy of the GDR is an example to the Soviet Union, and just trying to compare East Germany to the other Eastern Bloc countries like Poland and Hungary or Romania, that each of them had their own problems, but was East Germany from the beginning, but also later, still a country that the Soviets treated differently from the other ones?
Yeah, I think it also retained a lot of its sort of national peculiarity. So there's almost like an acceptance there from the Soviets that it is still Germany. So for example, it's allowed to keep the German colors on its flag, and actually initially they're not even allowed to put their own emblem on it. So in the 1950s, they're constantly, the German communists in East Germany are constantly arguing that they want their own flag. And with their own emblem on it, and basically, the Soviets are still so keen to make unification at least a possibility that they tell them they can't. So the emblem later, the GDR emblem is basically only added onto the German flag as well. When all of that becomes impossible, basically, and everybody agrees that this division is there to stay. The army, for example, the National People's Army, the NVA, receives uniforms that look more like the Wehrmacht uniforms than kind of inventing a new thing or making them Soviet style. There are a lot of elements of Germanness that East Germany is allowed to keep, whilst in Hungary, for example, textbooks are being rewritten, and in Poland they try and undermine Polish nationalism at every angle that they can. Other countries are supposed to be Russified. That doesn't really happen in East Germany for lots of reasons. There's always this kind of exceptionalism there, and on top of it, as you say, Ulbricht becomes very arrogant as well. That's largely due to the fact, I would say, that the living standards are higher. So East Germany also doesn't see, apart from that, from the early 1950s, when you see this giant uprising in 1953. But after that, the economic situation, at least at surface level, seems stable enough. So people don't go hungry. They don't have kind of lack of food in the way that, for instance, triggers the Solidarność movement in Poland later on because of the meat shortages. That sort of thing doesn't really happen in East Germany as well. And there's a sense there that it's more stable. The living standards are higher. Which is why Ulbricht, sort of starts lecturing the other countries on how to do socialism, basically, which, as you say, the Soviets didn't take particularly well.
No, but it sounds, of course, a little bit strange, taking into account the fact that in 61 the Berlin Wall was built, so that the last loophole of trying to leave the country was disappeared. And then at the end, I think you mentioned that the people remember the 60s as a period of stability, because things were going better. So somehow they of largely didn't have a too big problem with it, or just learn to live with the fact that they were living in a country that they couldn't escape anymore.
Yeah, I mean that works both ways. So there are, of course, people who are incredibly upset about the wall being built and who do remember this as a severe cut basically in their lives, or like a cut-off point basically, mainly because people who had relatives in the West basically now felt cut off, because most people who'd wanted to leave at that point, would have done so because it was still legal and possible and safe to do that by going through Berlin whilst that was still open. So a lot of people, obviously millions of people, had done that by 1961. And there were, however, the majority of people, I mean, let's not forget this, the majority of East Germans chose, even when they could have left, they chose to stay. Not necessarily and not at all actually out of loyalty to the regime as such, but because these were their homes, that was the region where they lived, where they had their work, where they had their houses and friends, and they just wanted to stay. And for those people, life had become incredibly difficult when a lot of people were leaving. So it was mostly kind of skilled individuals, like doctors, for example, left in their droves, engineers, people who just finished a certain apprenticeship or studied under the East German system and then left. All of that made it difficult for the people who stayed to get the economy back going, to go and see a doctor, to see a dentist, to get your house built or something, because all of these key workers were missing. So when that last sort of loophole was closed up, it was a huge tragedy for those who had relatives in the West, of course. But it ended up stabilizing the economy as well at the same time. So if you didn't have any direct reason as such to go to the West, basically, because you had relatives or because you wanted to leave, then conditions did become more stable for you, and that's kind of what a lot of people remembered. I mean, the 60s as well, I mean, you have the same in the West. They were also a period of huge technological progress. People were space age crazy, basically. Everybody was excited about the next exploration, sending satellites into space, first man on the moon, all of that kind of stuff happens. The first German in space was an East German, so people got very excited about that. The Soviets were shooting Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. So it looked as though there was a genuine chance that the East might catch up in this kind of race between the two systems. And also, kind of progress was made more widely visible as well. So you had, huge building projects. Alexanderplatz in Berlin is an obvious example, with the TV tower still dominating Berlin's skyline today, still the highest building in Germany today. And that was, of course, deliberate at the time, and is still very much the case today. So all of those things also pointed to a degree of optimism. Something is happening. It's the first time of stability, really. Let's not forget what those people had gone through, as well in their own lives. They've been through the Second World War, the rationing that came afterwards, the food shortages. Before that, they'd had Nazism. Before that, there was the Great Depression. After the Wall Street crash, the Weimar Republic was never a stable place to, for the economy to prosper. And before that, this is the First World War. You've got to be quite old at that point to have remembered any form of stability. And then in the 60s, suddenly there was peace. Yes, it was fragile, the international situation, but there wasn't outright war. And food was on the table, people had jobs, houses were being built, childcare was being expanded. So there were lots of reasons why people felt that things were stabilizing, and that's quite often what people remember when you talk about the 1960s. Whilst in hindsight, of course, the war for us feels as the big moment. For lots of people, it wasn't actually such a big moment. Not everybody, as I say, but some people did tell me when I spoke to them as well, that it wasn't as big a thing to them because it didn't concern them as much.
Okay. And let's move on to the end of the 1980s, where the GDR is 40 years old. Lots of people haven't experienced life before the GDR, and many people live a happy life. learned to live with the restrictions in the country, such as a lack of freedom to travel, a lack of certain products. I think that for East Germans, but especially for these people, the sudden changes in their country that started at the end of 1989, where it goes through a tsunami of events. The country doesn't exist anymore. Their employer is sold to a Western company for 1 Deutsche Mark. Social life changed, etc. This must have been psychologically incredibly hard for lots of East Germans.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge upheaval, I think, for people, and not one that was, I think, as obvious at the time as it is in hindsight, looking back now. Because people were just swept away by the tides of history, to use an old sort of metaphor there. As you say, in the 80s, I mean, a lot of people were getting more unhappy, and I try and describe that in the book as well, simply because there was no possibility of progress anymore. People just couldn't see where things were supposed to go. And the GDR was struggling economically. The Soviet Union was crumbling at the same time. Gorbachev, who came in 1985, basically said, this time, if there's any trouble, we won't help you out. Unlike in 1953, where the Soviets crushed the uprising, that wasn't going to happen. So there are a lot of external factors that came together and that weren't necessarily, the regime wasn't able to hide that from the public. And at the same time, the public expected that progress that we were talking about earlier in the 1960s and 70s for that to continue, and instead they got stagnation and even regression in many ways, both economically and in terms of the way that politics had sort of calcified. And I think all of these things came together and then escalated in 89, as they did across Eastern Europe. It's not just East Germany, of course, when the border, for instance, gets opened between Hungary and Austria, the old sort of allies, if you will, or the people, like peoples that were once part of an empire, rejoining one another. Then from that moment onwards, it didn't make any sense to keep the wall standing, because people could have just left through that route when that kind of just replaced the Berlin option that was there up until 1961. So all of these things came together, I think, to create this huge moment in history that happened, and allowed East Germans enough space to sort of, let their anger that had been bubbling under the surface, I think, come to the fore. And people taking to the streets in their hundreds of thousands and bringing the state down in the so-called peaceful revolution. And the fact that of course would make a huge difference to everybody's lives, both for the better and for the worse in different cases, and sometimes in the same cases. That there were two aspects to the way that people's lives changed. I don't think was as obvious at the time to people as it became in hindsight. As you say, nobody knew basically what was going to happen to the economy. That what you do when the entire economy is basically, or almost the entire economy, is run by the state, and then suddenly you privatize that and you do it very quickly. There was no obvious process of doing that, because this doesn't happen all that often in history. And then suddenly for the West and for Western investors, it was a huge opportunity to, they basically called it the Wild East. You just go in there and buy everything and make investments. And so all of that all happened so quickly, I think, that it was difficult to process and to absorb for East Germany, basically. And that, I think, is what's still causing a lot of the debates today. What's still lingering is a lot of the stuff actually that happened after 1990 as a collective experience for East Germans, rather than what happened before. I think that has at least as big an impact on the way that we see disgruntlement and disaffection with politics today.
I think you also mentioned in the beginning of the call already also discussions that are going on currently in Germany. What's the things that are discussed most? Is it more like the people that don't feel recognized because the GDR was a country, and it was like after unification it was like added to West Germany and was not existent anymore? Or is it more like that the people have nostalgia, wanting the GDR back and claiming in the past everything was better? Or is it totally different things?
I certainly don't. No, I don't think it is the latter. I think what people want is an acknowledgement of their I mean, quite often people say it's their achievements. So by that, they mean basically they don't want to be told that their jobs were worthless or their lives were meaningless because they were lived in a dictatorship. And in that respect, I think my book has spoken to some people with that, because I do, take all of that seriously. And I think that's one of the aspects that was controversial about the book, is that I did just sit down and listen to people and just had them tell me their stories and their opinions without me telling them what they had to think about their own memories. And I think that that is one aspect of that. And that's not necessarily to say, that people like sit there and indulge in nostalgia as such, but what people do want to be able to do is think about their own lives in a way that isn't framed by others. So there's this demand almost that people now have some sort of reckoning with their own past. So I was asked, for instance, why am I not like the 1968 generation, in terms of them accusing their own parents, or their kind of questioning of their own parents, what they did, and asking that generation of Germans to confront their own Nazi past. People are demanding the same of East Germans today. Basically, look back on anything that you did. So if you worked in a factory, does that not make you part of the regime? Does that not mean you helped to uphold dictatorship? And people have their own memories, of their lives, and are now being told to like politicize them basically, and then question them, and learn from that experience and become better people almost today. And I think that's very patronizing to basically say to people that at the time they had no awareness of what they were doing, and they kind of just were cogs in the system. So I think that's part of the issue. I think the other thing that people are upset about is that the democracy that they were promised and that they had envisioned isn't the same as what they experience in their day-to-day lives today. So when people feel that they have no option to vote for a political party that actually reflects their interests and takes their concerns seriously, they feel numb. They feel like they're not part of the system. They feel they're not part of the dialogue that they were kind of promised in 1990 or even beforehand as well. And that often leads to disaffection. And when they then start criticizing this current form of democracy as it exists in Germany today and say, this isn't working for me because X, Y, and Z, they get told that they don't know how democracy works because they grew up in a dictatorship. And that, of course, leads to a huge amount of frustration, because democracy should be a dialogue, and they should be working for everybody who lives in the state. There should be an option for you to make your voice heard, or a possibility to voice any discontent without being told that you just don't understand how the system works. And I think that's led to a very kind of strong anti-establishment sentiment in the East in particular, where people say none of the mainstream parties hear me, none of them have got any Easterners in them, or kind of, visibly care about the concerns that people have specifically in the East. And as a result of that, they go to parties that make them believe that they care about their issues. And I'm thinking particularly of the far right AfD here, who are very, very good at sitting in local pubs, they organize events and things, and they sit there with East Germans and say, I hear your anger, I feel just like you. And they're very good at sort of catalyzing that anger and channeling it into their own political party, which is something I think that we're seeing now. But I think the experience that people made in 1989, of all of this kind of grassroots democracy that they experienced, people had all of these little protest groups that they could join. There was dialogue, there were roundtable discussions. People had a genuine feeling that they were part of a political process, and then that all went away. And I think that is also something that many people find frustrating. It's actually often the very same people that were on the streets in 1989 that are on the streets again today as part of kind of far right marches. So it's a really strange development that's hard to explain, but I think that is part of the problem, is that people didn't get the democracy that they were hoping for.
Could you simply summarize it as being a disappointment in the blühende Landschaften that Helmut Kohl promised, or is it a little bit, would it be too simply said?
No, I think that's an element of that. I think that's more of the economic side of it. I think people were also promised, there wouldn't be unemployment, there would be more investment there. And I mean, what they did do is pump lots of money into infrastructure. So in terms of roads and housing, the facades of houses now look much nicer. You know, the state that East German buildings were in was terrible. I mean, it was a derelict country effectively. And when you now go into the East, you can see kind of everything is done up nicely and looks nice. But I think apart from that, you know, there was lots of infrastructure and things obviously sold out. So there's entire areas now that are just empty, really. When you go into villages and stuff, there's nobody on the streets. It's very quiet. You know, people have moved away. I don't think I've got any friends from my school days that actually still live in the region where I'm from, because there's just no opportunities there. I mean, you can't stay and have a life there because there's no jobs, there's no career prospects, there are no facilities. All of that was closed down. Lots of these kind of weird investments in the 90s that people tried, you know, like things like shopping centers, bowling alleys, you know, whole villages that were supposed to be turned into theme parks and stuff like that, you know, and all of that, of course, fell flat on its face. That was just a waste of investment money, basically, that the state offered, and that in itself adds to very sad landscapes. You know, when you're in a village somewhere and there's this like building from the 1990s that was never completed or finished, or that opened briefly and then went bankrupt again and had to close. You know, all of this kind of stuff makes for very depressing kind of landscapes in the East in some regions.
So you just mentioned that you had a lot of interviews with people. There must have been also some special ones. The interviews that really impressed you. Do you have an example, or do you have something that you have still in mind?
Yeah, two actually. I mean, one was meeting Egon Krenz, which was a strange experience. So Egon Krenz was the last sort of communist leader, if you will, of the GDR, who briefly took over from Erich Honecker in the autumn of 1989, and that was just very strange. He lives in a tiny little house by the Baltic Sea, all by himself, and you know, to sort of sit there and drink coffee with him whilst he's telling you about all of these you know, events of his life, going all the way from his kind of youth as the child of refugees from the East, then, you know, being kind of recruited into the youth elite, a sort of, you know, development grooming scheme of the party, to becoming the leader of the party in the end, was a bizarre experience to sit in this kind of mundane environment of his small house, drinking coffee and listening to somebody relating those kind of big world events. I mean, the papers have made a lot of that afterwards. You know, it's kind of like, how dare I speak to him, and he's become my mentor and all the rest of it, which is of course complete nonsense. I mean, he's somebody who witnessed the events of the time from within, and therefore is an interesting person to talk to amongst many others. But that was quite memorable, of course. And then in terms of the kind of ordinary East Germans, there was a lady I spoke to who was born in the 1920s, so she's now in her 90s, an accountant, and she told me about how she was an accountant during the Berlin blockade, and I thought it was just fascinating. So she worked for a company that was based in what was then becoming West Berlin, but which had many East Berliners working for it. And so when the new currency was introduced, the Deutschmark in the West, she was tasked as the accountant of the firm. She was tasked with separating that out from the salary that the East German workers were, or the kind of workers from the Eastern sector, it wasn't split then yet, in 1948, were getting. And she told me how she sat there with two pens, a green pen and a red pen, trying to get the two salaries and the two currencies apart, you know, as these events around her were unfolding. And it just brought home to me how, you know, we think of politics and of history as these kind of big things that happen almost detached from the people that they're happening to. Like, we very rarely think of world events as things that actually affect people directly. We think of them in terms of their political consequences, their economic consequences, as a kind of big picture. And in my head, I suddenly had this kind of idea of the Berlin blockade, you know, with all of its political and historical connotations. But you're thinking of one person that's caught up in that and is still here to tell you about it. You know, and just the way that it affected her own life, it really does bring home what you actually talk about as a historian when you talk about these kind of big world events, that they're not just abstract things that happen, but actually they do affect the lives that people lead, which is kind of the approach that I took, with the book. That was the whole point, was to try and tell the big story of the GDR, but tell it in a way that makes it obvious, what that meant for the people who lived there at the time. And she really kind of encapsulated that, Inge Schmidt, in my book.
No, it must have been very special talking to her. So you were still very young when the GDR ceased to exist. So digging now into the country's history, did you have a moment where you think, well, I wish I was a little bit older. I would have wished to live a few decades or maybe years in the GDR just to have the full experience, or not?
No, I don't think I do. I mean, it's very, very hard to tell what I would have personally made of, living in the GDR, but I have a feeling that the lack of freedoms would have affected me directly. I think I would have been one of those people who would have found it very difficult without being able to get out of the country or speak to people, or also with the constant interference of the government in your day-to-day lives. Being at school, you get told kind of how to behave or what to do. So I'm not sure, just for the sake of curiosity, whether I would have wanted to, kind of subject myself to sort of 10-20 years or so of living in the GDR, despite the fact that in the 80s it was, of course, very possible to find ways around that. There were enough sort of subcultures and things like that going on, for people to find niche ways kind of to make their own way in life. But I don't think it's quite the same as sort of growing up in a place for all its faults that allows you to do your own thing and sort of develop freely. So I don't think I would have traded that in for the sake of academic curiosity. Would I go back there if there was a kind of time machine that I could just go in and out? I think that is more appealing, kind of going back to see what it's like and study it as an outsider who is able to withdraw from it. Similarly, actually, to what some Western kind of historians and journalists and so on did at the time when they were traveling back and forth, but because they had the nationality of another country, they could get back out.
Yeah, I think there would be a lot of people that would like to join you on that time machine voyage.
Yeah.
So I think we're coming to the end. So just curious about you said you're still very busy traveling. So any plans for a next book? So you covered already the period till 1918 for Germany, then you started 1948. So there I see a gap, or maybe more about East Germany, or anything in mind already, or anything, or working on anything?
Yeah, I've started working on a new book. It'll be on Weimar, as in the city of Weimar, which I think is a very interesting lens through which to see what's going on in the whole of Germany. I mean, Weimar is like one of those places that is just so deeply associated with Germany, because everybody projects onto it what they want. It's seen as almost like the heart, I would say, of kind of German culture. People think of poets, of Goethe and so on, of the theatre, and things like that. And that's exactly the reason why after the First World War it was chosen as the name, sort of rebrand Germany and move away from the militarist image that it had, get away from Prussia as well. It was part of Prussia. And kind of find a more neutral and more civilized and more cultural sort of version of Germany. And then it's also in Weimar where it first failed. So in Thuringia, the state around Weimar, you have the first Nazi government in from 1930. So this is supposed to be the place where Germany reinvents itself, and it's also the place where that first fails to happen, and you get, in fact, the largest concentration camp on German soil, Buchenwald, right outside of Weimar. So it's what I'm trying to do basically is look at the city between the two world wars, so between 1919 and 1939, and look at a range of people that lived in it. From, I've got an actress, for example, the mayor of Weimar, social democrats who were trying to fight the rise of Nazism, but then also Hitler and Hindenburg, who saw Weimar also as the place of national rebirth. there's the Bauhaus movement. So I'm trying to look at a kind of a range of different people from all sorts of background to see how they responded to these big changes that were happening between 1990 and 1939, to then be able to draw some conclusions about what was happening more widely with society in Germany. So it's like a little microcosm. So hopefully many readers will join me in Weimar when it's done, when it's out. There's a lot of research to be done. There's so many historical sources. The city archive and the state archive of Thuringia have both got so many records and postcards and letters and newspaper snippets and all sorts of things. So it'd be really interesting, but there's lots of work to do. So I'm looking
really
forward to it. But yeah, it's a great project to be working on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, looking forward to the result already. So thank you for very much for the interview, Katja. It was very interesting. And I'll leave the links to the books in the description. If people don't have an idea what to buy as a Christmas present, so I think that would be a good idea. Thank you for your time, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Olaf.